Hi everyone, and welcome to our latest webinar on Is Your Business Ready to Report in Line with the TCFD? As the world focuses increasingly more on prioritizing tackling climate change, all industries, including the business world, are bringing in regulations to adapt to a rapidly changing globe. Today we'll hear how the development of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures impacts business and the opportunities it provides and challenges it brings. But first, a few housekeeping notes. So, social media, please tag RSK Group and use the hashtag Green Dialogues. You can find us on Instagram, the RSK Group, LinkedIn RSK Group, Facebook RSK Group, and Twitter by searching at RSK Group. We would love to have you follow along the conversation as we get stuck into today's panel. And a few other notes before we get started. So all attendees' microphones are automatically muted throughout the webinar. During the presentation, you can post questions and there will be a Q&A session at the end. As many questions as possible will be answered, and those that can't be due to time constraints will be addressed after the webinar. Shortly after the session ends, you will receive a link to a short survey. If you could take a few minutes to provide feedback, please, so we can improve on future webinars, it would be greatly appreciated. So first up, I would like to introduce our beginning speaker, Marie-Claire Tabone, who is Project Manager at the Financial Reporting Lab at the Financial Reporting Council. Hi, Marie-Claire.
Hi, Lucy.
So Marie-Claire joined the FRC in June 2020 and leads the lab's work on sustainability issues, including stakeholders, TCFD, and other environmental, social, and governance issues. Before joining the FRC, Marie-Claire was on a secondment from PwC as a technical fellow at the International Accounting Standards Board on the Management Commentary Project, and previously she was a manager in PwC's Global Investor Engagement team. Really looking forward to what you have to say, and I will leave you to it.
Thank you, Lucy, and it's really great to be here and be able to speak at this webinar. The main focus of my presentation will be on the lab's report published last October, but I will start with a quick overview of what TCFD is and the regulatory landscape in the UK. So the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was set up in 2015 by the Financial Stability Board because it recognized the need for more transparency on the financial implications of climate change and how companies were adapting to both physical and transitional risks and the related opportunities. The task force drew its members from the G20 with some of the biggest companies and investment firms for a truly market-led initiative to develop disclosure recommendations which lead to decision useful information for investors, debt providers, and insurers. So the recommendations were published in 2017 and are centered around 4 pillars or thematic areas based around how companies manage their business and what investors really want to understand. So governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Under each of these pillars, there are 2 or 3 recommended disclosures, making up a total of 11 disclosures. Since 2017, many companies have voluntarily reported, partly driven by investor demand, as well as regulatory signals, that TCFD disclosures will eventually be mandated. Up to September 2021, our analysis showed that more than 200 UK companies had made extensive reference to TCFD in their annual report and to an extent some TCFD disclosures. We're obviously expecting to see a significant increase this year as the requirements have now come into effect and we're starting to see the first reporting against regulation here in the UK. So first, the UK's Financial Conduct Authority's Comply or Explain rules for premium listed commercial companies with years ending 31st December 2021 have to do the Comply or Explain rule against the 11 recommended disclosures. And this is being extended to standard listed companies as well for the reports that we'll see published next year. There is then a broader regulatory scope through the UK Companies Act, which we also refer to as the base requirements, and this is based on size thresholds. So for companies with more than 500 employees, in the case of listed and named companies, and this is extended further, there's a threshold of over £500 million turnover for private companies and other organisations. The Companies Act requirements are a bit less detailed than the comply or explain rule, and I recommend looking at the base Q&A, which was published recently to understand the differences. So the lab's report that we published back in October builds on previous work by the lab, primarily the climate disclosures report we published back in 2019, and then further on the wider FRC climate thematic, which was published in 2019. The report, which was a desktop review looking at reports published in 2020 and 21, and also took on investor views based on discussions and research. It highlights the investor perspective on what they want to see from climate disclosure. So it is an investor-focused approach. It includes a set of questions for boards and management to consider and think about what they need to disclose. And I think this is one of the key takeaways from the report, which would be really useful for companies to think about as they plan their disclosures. The report identifies the areas of weaker disclosures and where improvements are needed. And really, the issues that were highlighted in our previous work were seen to be still prevalent. The report also includes examples of better practice, and it highlights different approaches to how certain areas could be addressed. And it's important to know we didn't identify one perfect example which addressed all the TCFD disclosures, but we identified particular examples on particular areas. So companies should really take them in the context of their own circumstances. So what did investors tell us they want to understand on climate disclosures? I think it really aligns with what the TCFD pillars actually are. And they want to understand how boards are considering the issues and what oversight they have, how the business model could be impacted, and how strategy is being adapted to meet the challenges from climate. What are the risks and opportunities, and what is their prioritization, likelihood, and impact? And how is the company measuring the performance and impact in relation to climate and keeping track of where it needs to be? And in terms of where the issues that need to be addressed and where improvement is needed, I think one of the main concerns has been lack of specificity to the business itself. We ended up seeing, unfortunately, a lot of boilerplate disclosure. And there wasn't enough detail on how companies' business models were really being affected. Again, disclosures on risks and opportunities were also lacking substance and sometimes focused too much on the opportunities or the positive. And there wasn't enough information on how the risks would crystallize and how the strategy would respond to address those risks. Scenarios also remain an area of weak disclosure, and scenarios are one key area which investors are really interested in, especially those that affect viability. We also noted a lack of clarity on pledges and targets around net zero, and companies should really make it clear what are purely ambitions and what they are actively pursuing and how they are tracking those targets. It's worth noting that the lab is actually just launching a project on net zero disclosures, and we will be looking to publish a report in September. And if you are interested in participating, please do get in contact. Another area which needs improvement is the explanation of performance against targets. And what we noted as well, that sometimes there was just a focus on a particular area of the business, which maybe was doing better. And then as a result, you're obscuring the performance of the business as a whole. The scope and the basis of calculation of metrics could also be sometimes unclear. In the report, we also include some areas that companies need to consider in making their TCFD disclosures. So that is also considering the impact of climate on the financial statements and ensuring there is consistency between what's in the front half of the annual report and the financial statements. And the need to not just consider the impact of climate on the company, but also the company's own impact. The location of where you include the TCFD disclosures, whether outside the annual report or within the annual report itself, is also an important one. And I think based on materiality and even the regulatory requirements, the core elements of TCFD should really be included in the annual report, although cross-referencing can be permissible. But under the FCA rule, you will also need to think about explaining why you have included disclosures elsewhere. So to sum up, in terms of what you should think about for ensuring better practice and avoiding some of the issues we highlighted, I think it's important to be really specific to your business and explain what is impacted and how. Provide information across the different time horizons, so short, medium, and long term. Provide information that is representative of the whole company and not just focus on good news stories. And related to that, make sure you're providing information across different business segments or business units, and also over different time periods so that you can allow comparison over time and better identification of issues. Be clear on methodologies and where external assurance has been obtained. And where discussing commitments and targets, it is quite helpful to set out interim targets so you can really clearly show the progress and how you are tracking it, and that helps with accountability as well. And finally, ensure you maintain a connected narrative throughout the annual report and not just a standalone section on climate. It is important to reflect this in your discussion of risks, strategy, and as I mentioned before, ultimately the financial statements as well. So I'll finish there for now and happy to take any questions later on in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much for getting us off to such a strong start. You mentioned that scenarios are an area of weaker disclosure. Do you have any specific recommendations for companies?
Yes, and I think even the regulators recognize that it is an area where companies are still developing their capabilities and expertise. And for the FCA comply or explain rule, I think in this first year, the FCA will accept explanations as long as the companies are setting out how they're planning to perform their scenario analysis in the coming year. And there's also a lot of guidance for companies to help them with scenario analysis. So there's the TCFD technical supplement and guidance on scenarios. The FRC lab actually also published a report on risks, uncertainties and scenarios, which includes various steps. And within the lab report on TCFD disclosures, there's also a spotlight on scenarios with some helpful tips to consider. At the same time as we published the report, the FRC had commissioned a joint research report with the University of Manchester, which fellow speaker Dr. Charnock was one of the researchers as well, and that sets out some helpful guidance. I think in terms of key points to remember, make sure you're clearly linking the scenario to the disclosures on the related principal risks. Again, explain the unique circumstances specific to your company and do not just provide generic narrative, and then report on the plausible actions that you're taking and not ones which are unlikely to be taken.
Thank you. And The TCFD disclosures you've looked at so far were voluntary. So what learnings can be applied to now mandatory requirements?
So I think what we highlight, it is what based on what investors want to see, is still a very good foundation of helping to meet the requirements. The FRC corporate reporting review is now undertaking a thematic review on TCFD against the FCA Comply or Explain rule. And that will be published later in the summer. But it will also be considering climate risks in its routine reviews. And I think, based on what I already mentioned, the consistency between narrative reporting and the financial statements is definitely one key area to keep in mind, and will be one area of focus for the reviews. So it's really important to link to the assumptions that are being highlighted in the annual report, and any disclosures on risks and uncertainties need to be consistent. And if there is an impact on the useful lives of assets, and whether any impairments are needed based on what you're saying the risks are to the company. So the consistency is really key. And again, they need to be really company-specific risk disclosures. And they will need to consider whether climate is a principal risk in its own right, or it's incorporated in other principal risks. Otherwise, they would need to explain why it's not the case for the company.
Makes sense. Well, thank you so much again, and we will see you again at the end for our group Q&A. But next up, I would like to introduce our second speaker, who is Alex White, Principal Analyst of Climate and Sustainable Finance at the New Zealand Ministry for the Environment. Hi, Alex. So Alex co-led the introduction of the world's first mandatory climate-related disclosure requirements in New Zealand. Before moving there, she was closely involved in the UK's Green Finance Task Force and advocated for mandatory TCFD reporting while at the Aldersgate Group. In the lead up to COP21, Alex worked with corporates to commit to setting science-based targets as part of a global campaign at CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. I will get off screen so you can get straight into it.
Thanks, Lucy. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks to RSK for having me on this webinar, and hi from New Zealand. So I will be sharing some lessons learned and observations from kind of two perspectives. One as the first country to announce that we would mandate TCFD disclosures, and also as an organisation that's actually done our own disclosure. So I think Katie behind the scenes is driving the slides for me today. Katie, could I get a next slide, please? Great, thank you. So I've just popped this on here in case you're interested in what the kind of scope of New Zealand's legislation on this is. But the reason that we decided to mandate climate-related disclosures is because we consider them to be a powerful mechanism to focus companies on the impact that climate change will have on them. And also because clear, consistent and comparable disclosures enables investors to make decisions that accurately reflect that risk. So if there's any questions about the actual scope, I can come back to that later, but I'll just move on for now. So next slide, please, Katie. Thanks. So so the New Zealand Ministry for the Environment decided that we should probably lead by example if we were going to require other people to make disclosures. So we did our own climate-related disclosure. To be perfectly honest, we were quite unsure about it to begin with, because we thought, well, you know, the TCFD has been designed for commercial entities and for the finance sector. I'm not sure it makes much sense to a public sector organisation that doesn't hold many assets, and really our job is writing papers. But actually we did find it to be a really valuable exercise, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But just to give you a sense of how we went about it, we did 3 scenarios on 3 timeframes, found a number of sort of key risks and opportunities, and have developed an action plan out of it. Next slide, please, Katie. So from those 2 viewpoints, I'm going to share 4 observations and lessons learned today. The first is get started with your existing risk profile. So I think, people can become quite overwhelmed with the idea of what climate change might mean for them and their business. And they might be thinking, oh, what's this sea level rise going to do to us, and so on and so forth. But actually, I think a really useful place to start is to think about what's your existing risk profile. So for example, if you are a company that relies significantly on transmission lines, which are affected by high winds all the time, this is a live example from New Zealand. We're very windy over here sometimes. If you have that as a risk anyway, then what's climate change going to do to that risk, right? And so what you're not thinking about is what will drought do for me in a business where drought has no impact on my supply chain or my risks or anything like that. So really kind of start with what you know, and really just kind of get going and learn by doing. It's the best way to do it. I think that also talks to Marie-Claire's point earlier that these things should be company specific, right? You will know your risks and where your risks lie better than anyone else can. And so start with what you know. My second point is that it really helps to bring in a variety of disciplines and viewpoints. So understanding your climate risk and what it could mean in several plausible futures requires work across the entire organization. And particularly to step outside of their kind of usual roles and bring together risk departments, corporate social responsibility departments, and so on. What you certainly don't want this to be is just a kind of, it doesn't work if it's just a sustainability exercise. I think we certainly learned that that was a very valuable experience, a very valuable way to go about it when we did our own disclosure. So not only did we bring people in from different business units who had different perspectives on how those risks might manifest and where the kind of pinch points were for them, but we also brought in people external to the organization. So we had lots of scenario analysis workshops where we invited people from different government agencies to observe the process, and also some of our key stakeholders who had a slightly different viewpoint from us, all of which was really useful for kind of stress testing our thinking. A third point is not to focus on false certainty in this. And the reason I raise this is because we hear a lot that people have some concerns that they don't have granular enough data, they don't have enough data, they can't possibly understand all the potential climate futures that there could be. And I think the key thing to say here is it's helpful to have that data, but it is an unknown, uncertain outcome in the future. And so if you try to fixate on the idea of getting a clear idea, then you might make decisions that actually are not that strategic in the longer term. So I think sort of going back to that first point, start with what you know, get started, and don't worry too much about having complete certainty. My final point is thinking about the strategic value that this can add to a company rather than considering it a compliance exercise. And so this is something we heard a lot when we were talking to our stakeholders when we were consulting on whether or not to legislate for climate disclosures. Those organizations who hadn't done it thought, well, this is going to be quite a compliance exercise. But the companies who had done it, interestingly, were telling us, we started off thinking that, but actually once we got into it, it gave us enormous value. It was another interesting lens to look at our strategy, and we learned kind of new things from it. So we've certainly heard from, for example, some banks, how it's giving them new insights into their core business, particularly around things like mortgage risk. And even as a public agency, we really found that there were good insights into our strategic risks. So we thought we were going in to do a climate exercise. And actually what we came out with was talking about workforce retention, staff well-being, kind of long-term stakeholder expectations, all the same things that we would be having in a non-climate sort of company strategy conversation. So I think what an interesting thing about the TCFD is, in addition to making sure that you're looking at it through that kind of strategic climate lens, is actually a very useful structure to examine some of where those pressure points might be and how well you're able to deliver on your strategic priorities in the longer term. That is me for now, Katie. So I'll leave that there and take any questions.
Thank you so much, Alex. So I would love to know, when the ministry released its own disclosure, were there any sensitivities about what information you could reveal, and how did you manage that?
Yeah, so I know it's a concern for lots of people about kind of revealing commercially sensitive information in their disclosures. And while we don't really have commercially sensitive information per se, a lot of what we do and we deal with in a government ministry is confidential because of, you know, all the political reasons around us. So there was some of that, and there were also a few elements that, to be honest, were just a bit awkward for us to publish. You would think, as the Ministry for the Environment, you should have this all under control, and the truth is that we didn't, right? So fortunately, our executive leadership team took a really sort of forward-looking approach to it. They saw the importance of demonstrating leadership, and that the key point was kind of drawing your line in the sand. What's your baseline so that you can hold yourself to account going forwards, and your stakeholders can hold you to account going forwards? Essentially, this is a transition for all of us. We're all kind of learning how to do this. On a more practical level, you know, confidential information we removed, we aggregated things up. And what we found is, you know, a lot of those things that we wanted to talk about, we could talk about anyway. It's not rocket science, right? These strategic risks to most organizations are foreseeable. Mm-hmm. I think just one other thing that's kind of key to point out here is what we're hearing from investors in our conversations at the moment is that they're currently more concerned that people are in fact making disclosures. You know, the big red flag for them isn't necessarily what's in your disclosure so much as if you aren't able or willing to kind of openly discuss your approach.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And were there any concerns among New Zealand businesses about introducing mandatory climate-related disclosures?
Yes. So we were starting probably from a slightly further baseline, further behind baseline in New Zealand than the UK is. So the UK has obviously had energy and carbon and energy efficiency reporting for over a decade, which New Zealand has not had. So it was kind of going from a standing start. So we did anticipate that there would be some resistance to it. In actual fact, we were quite surprised to hear that I think over 3/4 of the types of companies who were going to be affected by it were really supportive of it when we consulted on it publicly. And I think really what underlies that is that those companies saw that there was kind of the strategic value in doing this, and they could see that having better information, both for themselves but also across their kind of value chains, would help them make better decisions as well.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Thank you so much again. That was absolutely fascinating, and we will see you at the end for the group Q&A. Please keep your questions coming through. We've had lots of great ones already. But next up, we have Michael Ziman, who is Policy and External Affairs Director at the International Finance Reporting Standards Foundation. Hi, Michael.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Michael is currently playing an active role in setting up the International Sustainability Standards Board. Before this, he spent 10 years leading the policy and external affairs activities at the Climate Disclosure Standards Board to develop high-quality disclosure standards and thought leadership on environmental and social issues to drive greater consistency and comparability of the information that is reported to capital markets. I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. I will disappear.
Thank you very much, and thank you once again for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you today. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the future. You know, this webinar is around the TCFD and the you know, the application of it, but it's also good to keep in mind what's in the road ahead. To give you a bit of an introduction to the IFRS Foundation before I begin, though, in case you don't know us, we were set up back in 2001 as a not-for-profit organization working in the public interest to develop IFRS standards that bring transparency, accountability, and efficiency to financial markets around the world. And our standards on financial reporting have been adopted by more than 140 jurisdictions globally. We are of course, an organization that works in the public interest, and everything we do and develop is done through an extensive, inclusive due process as well. So we heard a little bit about the wonderful momentum that's taking place globally. The TCFD in particular has really taken the world by storm, and both in the voluntary space and the mandatory space, momentum is increasing, and it's really great. At the same time, what we're seeing is, of course, a number of approaches that have been established and developed, and so there are diverging approaches that companies need to comply with, or of course, investors need to compare and contrast. And so the market is really ripe to see how we can standardize and streamline the reporting landscape. And so with this in mind, the IFRS Foundation has consulted to understand whether it has a role to play in standardizing the landscape and producing a single set of standards to inform primarily that investor audience. And we have received an overwhelming number of responses to our consultation, over 750 responses. And the majority of the responses were resolutely saying, yes, we need you to play a role. And so with that in mind, we have set out to establish the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, to develop a global baseline of comprehensive sustainability disclosure standards related to enterprise value and primarily that investor audience. And that investor audience is really essential to our work. The work is, of course, will be designed to enable companies to provide a comprehensive sustainability information set for those capital markets, and taking into mind at the same time the differences and the diverging priorities of different jurisdictions, and make sure that the standards that we produce can facilitate additional requirements to be added as necessary by those jurisdictions. This announcement that was made at COP26 in Glasgow last year, and we're really happy to see the great number of organizations and even governments, over 40 finance ministers and central bank governors have supported it and welcomed the establishment of the ISSB when we made the announcement. So I'm talking about another standard, but what does this have to do with the TCFD? Well, the truth is that this work is designed to evolve the existing landscape and really harness the great work that has been done by the likes of the TCFD to streamline and standardize and really sort of create that comprehensive global baseline. So the work of the ISSB has been built on the foundations of the TCFD recommendations. Those 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, form the core of the work of the ISSB's work. Now, this means that once the standards are out, really you can evolve your reporting and go, of course, not just into reporting on climate, but other sustainability matters as well. So I'll stop there. In the interest of time, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. I would love to know, does the fact that the ISSB is launching standards mean that companies should stop using the TCFD recommendations?
An excellent question. The answer is no. Of course, as I mentioned, the work of the ISSB, the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, are building on the foundations of the TCFD and other standards in this space, the CDSB framework, the SASB standards, the integrated reporting framework. And so the best thing you can do is to keep going if you already are reporting in line with the TCFD, or get started if you aren't, because what will be coming out is just an evolution rather than revolution. So my recommendation is keep going.
And when will we see the proposed standards?
In a number of days, actually. So we are planning to go out for public consultation to publish our exposure drafts at the end of this quarter, which is coming nearing closely. So expect something very soon from us. And I'd like to say we really hope that you have a look at the standards and submit your views and responses. The work that we do is enriched by the public consultations, the public responses that we get, and that's very important to us.
Thank you, Michael. So we will be seeing you very shortly for our group Q&A. But next up, I'm going to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Robert Charnock, Research Director at RSK. Hi, Robert.
Hi, Lucy.
So Robert received the first PhD in carbon accounting from the LSE while working with the United Nations to develop a financial sector toolkit for analysing and managing the risks of climate change. His research now focuses on corporate transition plans and climate scenario analysis, and he recently led a research project for the UK's Financial Reporting Council. This year, he will be establishing a new climate strategy research institute in Singapore, which will be funded by RSK. Looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you, Lucy. Yes, so as Lucy mentioned, my next step is to build a new research institute in Singapore, which is why RSK asked me to join the webinar today to comment on the survey that they've recently conducted. So before moving on to the survey, I'll just very briefly explain this research institute. The aim, if you like, is to really contribute to the Asia Pacific and global debate on corporate climate strategy. And the way we want to do this is to build a bridge between academia and practice. So what we imagine is research projects that last anywhere from 6 to 12 months, focused on identifying the key questions that policymakers and business have at the moment, and bringing a real academic rigor and robustness to answering those questions and providing those answers quite quickly as well. I won't go into too much detail, but essentially the work streams, you've heard a lot about climate scenario analysis already, and that's one of our key areas, as well as how to audit these types of disclosures we're talking about today, which is rather tricky. And if you're in Singapore, you can't really talk about climate change without talking about water as well. So the water carbon nexus is a really important area for us. So we'll be working with the top universities in Singapore, so watch this space for that. But I'm here to talk about RSK's survey that they recently conducted. So to frame this, what I wanted to do is briefly present kind of where we are at the moment with TCFD. We've heard a lot already from the excellent 3 other presentations before me, so I'll be quite brief here. Really, with these initial TCFD reports that we see, companies are offering really an overview of their processes that they've used to look at climate change and initial insights into how climate change might affect their business. In some cases, we're seeing companies that have actually conducted climate scenario analysis. Some of them have done an excellent job, some are getting familiar with it, and I'd say if you're just getting familiar with it, you're already ahead of the curve. It's a difficult thing to do, and it's quite normal to feel anxious about that from the companies we spoke to last year for the FRC report that we produced. I'd also say at the moment, there's currently a focus on risk. And as has been mentioned, I think by both Mary Claire and Alex, strategy is a big part of this still that needs more work. So I think what we'll be seeing going forward is much more improvement on climate scenario analysis, essentially as companies build capabilities there, because it is a difficult thing to do. But once you've done it once, you're in a much better position to really sink your teeth into it. And then the second part is, if you haven't heard about them already, you're going to hear a lot more about corporate climate transition plans or transition plans. Essentially going beyond the risk debate and saying, what is your company's plan for aligning itself with the transition to net zero? Okay, but on the survey RSK conducted, I was very impressed to see that they received 100 responses from, I think this was from CFOs and their teams. And this was, the population for this was also the same that are under the most recent mandatory TCFD requirements. So these are some of the largest British businesses that responded. I won't go into the full survey in detail. I think RSK plans to send a link out after this webinar to everybody who attended, but there's a link to the report they've produced. I just want to pull out a few highlights and comment on them. So the first is really around sort of, there's quite a senior level confidence around TCFD and net zero, but there's not necessarily the action that you'd expect. The second is that greenwashing remains a real point of concern for most people looking at TCFD. But finally, that there is optimism that TCFD is heading in the right direction in the sustainability disclosure space. So if we look at the first one, why do I say senior level confidence? Well, we're seeing that 73% of the respondents said that they were confident they could meet the requirements to report in line with TCFD that are just coming online soon, and also confident in hitting their 2035 net zero targets as well. So, you know, at senior levels, some of the largest British business, they're saying, yes, we're confident we can do this well. What I would say, though, is when you look at the amount of attention being given to climate change at board level, it's perhaps not being discussed as often as it could be. Now, I know there are probably some academics on the webinar today who'll be surprised that boards are talking about climate change. But even so, considering it's such a hot topic and there's so much capacity building that needs to take place in the next year or two, I'm surprised that only a quarter of the companies are discussing it at board level on a quarterly basis. This really feels as though there has to be a lot more capacity building, establishing climate change working groups, understanding climate risk, discussing what a transition strategy looks like and what to do with key clients. There's a lot to be discussed right now, and I'd expect it to receive more attention at the senior level. Nevertheless, it's encouraging to see that it is receiving some attention at that level. The next is really this matter of greenwashing. And now, the first point on this slide isn't a new finding per se. That 85% of respondents were confused by the range of climate standards and disclosure initiatives that are out there. This has been the case for a little while. CDSB did a great job on trying to cut through that and help explain it to companies. But I think what was interesting is that combined with that, the fact that TCFD itself lacked guidance on best practice or industry-specific guidance, that was seen as being a real weakness that could make TCFD be seen as greenwashing. Now, companies might also greenwash, they might use this just to look good, but without that guidance in place, it's difficult to know what's expected. It's difficult to know what good practice looks like. So I think what you'd expect to see here, and why I wanted to comment on this one, is best practice in TCFD is probably going to be driven now at the industry level. You'll see excellent further guidance come out that's general to the economy as a whole, but the real progress that's being made is saying for individual industries, how can we establish a common basis from which all of our companies can begin? Because there are some sector-specific considerations on climate change that's quite important. So I'd expect to see this, it's almost good to see that people are anxious about this, but that the guidance that's coming in should help to mitigate this fear somewhat. And the final point is really about this TCFD being a step change and a step in the right direction as well. Because what TCFD requires is not simply a disclosure, it requires an entire analytical process, an entire strategic review to have been conducted before the disclosure can even be written, even drafted internally. And because of that, it requires cross-functional engagement that also goes to a much more senior level of the companies. So I think this is why at least 60% of respondents saw TCFD as driving senior level discussions better than other sustainability standards, for example. And also why 82%, I think, saw TCFD as making it easier to compare across companies because it was a common framework for looking at climate change. So there's optimism about TCFD driving senior level engagement, but also making it easier to compare climate performance across companies. And with that, companies know that what they disclose for TCFD is very easy to compare to their nearest competitors as well. So they really are going to face a much closer scrutiny from people who understand their sector in a lot of depth. But I think I'll leave it there for now. I'm very happy to take questions at the end as well. And like I say, I think RSK plans to send a link out to that survey after this webinar, maybe tomorrow. I don't know. Maybe Lucy can clarify. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. So I would like to know, the survey clearly shows greenwashing as a major concern. From your conversations with regulators and FTSE 100 companies, what can TCFD teams do to reduce the chance they'll be accused of greenwashing?
Okay, yeah, so the conversations I had with FTSE 100 is from the FRC report that I authored last year. As Mary-Claire said, that was published in October 2021. And what we saw working very well there is, I mentioned already that commercial sensitivities are an issue. You don't want to publish your entire strategy to all of your competitors. But what you can do is be transparent about the process that you undertook. And that's really key, transparency of process. If you can't be completely transparent about strategy and the outcomes and the detailed risks, be transparent about what you did internally for TCFD. So who was involved in this? How was this considered by your risk audit committees and the board? What actions, well, how were actions decided on at board level, for example, of what to do about these key risks? So if you can't be completely transparent about the strategy that you've decided or the commercially sensitive information, being transparent about your process is really a way to probably best practice and trying to avoid accusations of greenwashing.
Makes sense. And you mentioned transition plans on quite a few occasions. Why don't companies already have these, and how can they start creating one?
Yeah, okay. I think what's important to understand is about 10 years ago, climate risk was really started becoming a much hotter debate. And that's what drove things like TCFD being launched, what drove the interest of financial regulators from what I saw. Now that means that when TCFD has been used, everyone's been thinking about it in terms of risk. Quite normal, quite natural to do. But in order to do it well, you're going to have to look at your strategy more fundamentally and how you might need to change your business over the next 10, 20 years. So yes, you can identify key risks that you can try to manage, but at the same time, the whole strategy needs to be transitioned along with the economic transition to net zero. So in that regard, I think what's happened is people have been thinking so much about risk for 10 years that now we're only just starting to think about climate strategy, what that means and how companies can even start developing their own transition plan, because it will be challenging, but I think, as has been said by a few of the other panelists, getting started on this is really the only way forward. There's a lot of capabilities to build and a lot of discussions to be had, so just get started, and soon enough you'll have a solid transition plan and a strong climate scenario analysis to go with it as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to get you to stay on camera and invite the other panelists back on as we now are into our Q&A session. We've had a lot of questions through. We're going to try and get through as many as possible, but as I mentioned before, we will answer them after the session finishes if we can't answer them. So welcome back, everybody. And the first question we have from our listeners is, do the speakers have any recommendations on reporting climate disclosures with uncertain or low quality data? How can we avoid drawing inaccurate conclusions from immature data? Michael, you're nodding, so I'm going to pick on you first.
Well, I feel like very much feel your pain there. Whoever asked the question, I think both Alex and Rob have alluded to a little bit. First and foremost, being transparent about the uncertainties and sort of qualifying the disclosure is very important. Some others, I'm sure, will have other points to add, but I think that's being transparent about what your data mean, what your disclosure means, and what it doesn't mean is an essential part to build that trust, of course, of the reader as well.
Yes, I think it's better than to be silent and not include any information at all, because that will just raise more questions. But yes, be transparent about the process and kind of explain how you're working on getting better data. It is a journey, and I think expectations are aligned with the difficulties of the process as well. There is an understanding that it is still an area that requires more development.
Perhaps just add to those comments. I think they've covered most of it already, but a lot of this work is about the future, and the future is always going to be uncertain, right? So you can always try to get better data to minimize those uncertainties and build your confidence. But if you're looking at the future, you're never going to get rid of uncertainty. So part of this is about disclosing how you're grappling with that. And that's just what corporate strategy is about anyway. It's always been about this. Climate change doesn't introduce that for the first time. Corporate strategy has to look at the future, which is uncertain, and make judgments about the right way forward. So in that sense, it's not necessarily new. Yes, you can get better data, but you're never going to, this work's never going to churn out answers per se. It's going to churn out valuable insights based on which you can make strategic judgments.
That makes sense. And the next, oh, sorry, Alex, go ahead.
That's all right. I was just going to chip in, just to really thoroughly agree with what all the other panelists have said. I think just 2 extra points to add is to the question of how do you avoid drawing inaccurate conclusions on from immature data. I think what's really useful is not only disclosing the limitations of that data, but really getting to grips with it yourself and understanding it. And I know that's quite a challenging thing, right? So, for example, us in the ministry, we aren't by and large data scientists. We don't have, and climate data is another thing on top of that. So it's just taking a bit of time to interrogate and understand so that you know in yourself what those kind of limitations are. I think is an important step to it, so that you don't start to try and draw inaccurate conclusions. And then the other thing I would say is just the more that you and your organizations need that data and demand that data from your data providers and your supply chains and your value chains, the better that data will become. So back to the point of, just kind of get going.
That is a very valid point. Thank you. And so just moving on to our next question, because we do have a lot, and I'm going to try and get through as many as possible. Where can we get advice on how to include climate risks in our business reporting? Are there any good resources out there?
Well, the lab report on risks, uncertainties and scenarios is probably a good start, and also our report on TCFD disclosures that can be quite helpful. There's also a lot of TCFD guides published by the TCFD itself, which I think is a good place to start. And there's the TCFD hub as well, which I think is still live, which was worked on by the CDSB. Mike, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think, yeah, the TCFD hub is a useful resource. It's sort of I'd like to think of it as a search engine for TCFD resources. So you can filter by your industry or your country, and of course the recommendation that you're looking for. So there's even an online, a 1-hour online course that was developed by GARP, the Global Association of Risk Professionals.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so next question. I understand that TCFD disclosures should be firmly owned by the board, but if they're not engaging with TCFD as much as I think they should be, how much should a sustainability lead push this? I'm concerned this will get pushed onto my shoulders when the board should be engaging with this. So any advice on how to push this if you think your superiors aren't really kind of going as they should be?
I'll make one quick comment if that's okay. I think, so we spoke again with about 16 different FTSE 100 and FTSE 250 companies last year. And one of the big things that came out of those conversations was that TCFD is cross-functional. And what that means is that you can gain the influence potentially of the risk teams and particularly the finance function as well. So if you work across these different teams, then suddenly you've got multiple different pathways to the board to get their attention, some of which have much stronger relationships with the board as well. So leverage that. And then the other side that worked well in a couple of cases we saw is try to put a monetary figure on climate risks that you identify, on the key climate risks. That's very difficult to do, but there were a couple of cases we saw where the TCFD team put the financial figure on the risks, had said that they thought they were material risks and would therefore need to be included in the annual reports. And suddenly the board of directors leapt into action because they realized they might have to disclose a huge new risk in their annual reports. There's various ways that you can prompt action because it is serious, and these are potentially material risks that need consideration.
To further emphasize what Rob has said, I think even on broader ESG issues where the finance team is involved, and if you get the buy-in from the CFO and the finance team, then it's easier to take it to the board. And I think that is where there is stronger controls and more interest on the area. Then I mean, it is an important issue for the board to consider. But and TCFD, I mean, the name in itself is also about financial. It's linked to the financial disclosure. So I think getting them involved is really important, and not just leave it to a separate sustainability function. And again, with the reporting, it shouldn't be just in a separate climate section or response sustainability section within the report. It needs to go across strategy and risk.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question for Michael, but obviously if anyone else has something to add, please jump in. TCFD members included representatives from large business. Who will the ISSB be shaped by? Is there private sector influence, and what are the pros and cons of this?
A really excellent question as well. The way the IFRS Foundation works, and that will of course be reflected in the ISSB, is highly collaborative and based on engagement by all actors, especially those report bearers and the investors as well. So there are a number of advisory bodies being set up currently to support the work of the ISSB, which will of course include members of report bearers, those businesses, but also report users, investors, as well as other civil society, multilaterals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And very important to reiterate the upcoming consultation. We really do want feedback from the market, and we really hope that all of you listening will consider responding. This will be invaluable to make sure that the standards that are published are of the best possible quality.
And then the next question is back to the group. I really liked Alex's point about understanding and disclosing the current risk profiles. Are the imminent TCFD standards going to include a requirement to look back on recent climate hazard exposures and the effectiveness of risk treatments?
I can start us off to say that from a New Zealand perspective, I can't really speak to the standards because they're being developed by our independent standard setter, which will be working with the ISSB. So I can't really speak to that, except to say that does sound like it might be a useful exercise. Maybe I'll pass this over to Mike, though, who's probably in a better position to answer.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Again, I can't speak on behalf of the sort of New Zealand approach. But of course, looking back at risk is of course part of disclosures. I think the much of the disclosures are of course forward-looking as well, looking at potential risks that might arise in the future. But you might of course see sort of disclosures looking at the financial impact or risks that may have taken place in the past.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? Otherwise, I will move on to the next question.
Lucy, I'll just quickly say that in the conversations we have with TCFD teams, that where there had been recent climate hazards, that was a very common starting point for getting engagement across the company. So there were a couple of disclosures we saw that also included those as sort of examples they could use. So I can't comment on whether it would be part of the disclosures, but recent climate hazards really does seem to focus attention inside companies during this process.
That makes sense, thank you. And so the next question is, what impact on improving action on the climate emergency has this reporting done?
I can jump in here because there was actually a key part to my presentation that I forgot to say, which actually Rob then picked up a bit on in his presentation. Sorry. So one of the best things that we've seen happen in New Zealand since making this announcement is actually there's a whole sector, the seafood sector has got together, kind of off their own backs, and they've done a kind of cross-sectoral scenario analysis. So they all came in to make sure they've got the same assumptions and kind of tested each other out on it. And they've obviously each got different businesses and slightly different positionings and even different products. But ultimately they came together and they said, right, we can see that these are the major physical and transition risks for the seafood sector in New Zealand over the next, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And as a result of that, what they've done is they got to that common position, which is on one hand, quite useful for them to kind of have that comparability across the industry. But then also building on that, they've created a transition strategy for the sector. So it's kind of a collaborative effort. It really helps them speak with one voice to come and talk to us in the government. And that kind of helps us make sure that we're targeting our interventions in a way that's really quite meaningful and can have as much impact as possible. And they've got a really clear sort of like roadmap, timeline. This is how we're going to make things happen. So that's a really good example, I think, of how it's making a difference.
And I'll jump in. Yeah, I completely agree with you, Alex. I think that's a really encouraging thing to see. I'll come at it from a slightly different angle, which is that if we're going to transition to net zero, we need a lot of different groups pulling in the same direction. this can't just be entirely driven by policymaking and regulators alone. We need to have civil society groups, governments around the world, all the different regulatory systems and businesses all aiming towards that net zero route. And something like TCFD focuses the attention of business on that transition, on looking at the impact it has, and not just the risks, hopefully soon also the strategy for aligning with that transition, that just make sure that the business community isn't falling behind in supporting the transition, because we're seeing a lot of these other groups getting on board with the transition to net zero, and TCFD is now focusing minds within business on how to align the company with that. And the aggregated effect across economies is that the businesses within that economy can start driving towards net zero more than they have been doing recently, but there'll still be a lot of work to do to ratchet up those pressures to go further.
Thank you. Oh, Marie-Claire, do you have something to add?
I was just going to say that in terms of disclosures on transition plans to net zero as well, I think there will be an expectation to align those with TCFD disclosures in general, and they're a helpful foundation to think about how we are transitioning to net zero.
And if I could just bookend what I said earlier, I've thought of another point, which is I think a lot of where this comes from is that finance is like a key lever in the transition, right? If you can get the money to flow, the whole thing is a lot more straightforward. And so this is a key way to enable that to happen, so that investors have the information that they need to make effective decisions with that kind of long-term risk built in.
That makes sense. Well, unfortunately, that is all the questions we have time for today. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and I hope you've all found today's discussion as interesting as I have. Obviously, that's a long way to go, but as all of our panelists highlighted, the best time starts now. And it's important to remember that these aren't just regulations for regulation's sake, and they are guidelines to help the business world and all of us adjust to a rapidly changing future. The report that Robert was discussing will be emailed out to all attendees, so don't worry about searching for that. Thank you everyone for joining us, and to all of you for your brilliant questions. Just a reminder to please fill out the feedback survey that you will receive 1 hour after the webinar ends. And the details of our next webinar in the Green Dialogue series will be on the RSK website in the coming weeks, so do keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much again, everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.